Good to see you. Here we are again.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the Senate Transportation Committee hearing on January 17th, 23. I'd like you to welcome us in joining and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, and Senator Waters will do the honor in leading us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Senator Waters. The chair will open the public hearing on SB 52 and recognize Senator Lang.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members, for taking my testimony today as I introduce Senate Bill 52FN. So this bill was brought to me by the Clean Energy Group and asked me to please sponsor this bill. And after thinking about the bill and its implications, I wanted to sponsor this bill to bring out to highlight some information and talk about why this EV charging stations are going to be important to our state. So one thing, as a point of fact, in 2020 to 2022, electric vehicles rose from a little over 2% of the driving population to over 7% of the driving population. So there's a significant rise just in the last 2 years, and that number will go higher. If you look at the state of California, I believe their rate is approaching 25% of all vehicles on the road are electric vehicles. So why is this important to us? So for me, as the chairman of Ways and Means, and thinking about the meals and rentals tax and the significant amount of tourism that comes from our neighboring states, and specifically Massachusetts, which accounts for a big portion of our tourism industry here in the state. If you think about someone in Boston with their EV car deciding to go up to Loon Mountain to go skiing, they need to be able to plug their EV car back in order to get back home to Boston. It may or may not be able to make the full round trip on a single charge. If they don't have the infrastructure in place, Maine and Vermont are making lots of infrastructure improvements to be able to allow for EV charging in those states. So they may choose to take that ski trip instead of going to Loon, is to go over to Vermont, to one of the Vermont ski resorts instead. And so the availability of charging stations will have an impact on our tourism and how that goes. And the impact on our tourism will have an impact on our meals and rooms tax, which will have an impact on the monies we send back to our communities. So there's a state interest in looking at these at what we do. However, there's a word of caution in this tale, and that is the fact that the work that is done in the bill, it's called the front of meter work. They'll also call it make ready work. This is all the work that's done from the pole to the meter. So to get the electricity to wherever they want to put the charging stations. That work is rate recoverable, which means that if Eversource does $1 million worth of work, they can increase our rates on electricity to recover that $1 million of work that they did. So you have a delicate balancing act here. We want to be able to put these charging stations in so we can encourage our tourism and keep that trade moving. At the same point, the last thing I want to do is pass a bill that's going to drive up electric rates. So it's a balancing act that I think this committee will have we'll hear from lots of other people about it. I did talk to Don Chris, our consumer advocate, just to confirm, in fact, that make ready work is rate recoverable. So I wasn't misspeaking. I spoke to him today about that. So it is, in fact, a rate recoverable activity of the utility. The other aspect of this is about what state aid is available and what federal aid is available through various funding sources. I talked to DES about the VW fund. I was looking for how can we use an existing funding source maybe to make the make ready work pay the utilities, because all of our funding that we have that is being put into from federal agencies and from state, like the VW lawsuit, goes to the consumer side. So it's the meter, the other side of the meter, not the make ready work, but the business work. And that's where the incentives are going right now, is to these businesses that are going to be standing up with the ultimate goal of making money, but we're giving them incentives to put in these charging stations because of the huge expense, and not giving anything to the utilities, which the only, as Mr. Chris said, the only wallet that the utilities have is the ratepayers. So when they go back to get money, the only place they can go is back to the ratepayer. So I think this bill is extremely important. I think there'll be some, you have a fine balancing act in looking at this language of this bill. I presented it as it was presented to me by the clean energy industry because I was struggling with how to get the funding source. There is one thing we might be able to talk about and do another amendment is have a nice little conversation with the governor and using ARPA funds because a lot of this work is one-time work. Right, it's a batch of money that gets put in to run the wires, run the poles, put in the transformers to get the electricity wherever the charging station is, and there may be an opportunity to use some ARPA funds that will expire in a year and a half, or 2 years from now, to get some of this initial make-ready work to get some charging stations in place. And with that, I'll end my testimony.
Thank you for your testimony. Do any members of the committee have any questions for Senator Lang?
Senator Lang, as far as how far up north, as you know, I'm in District 1, near the Canadian border, and there's a lot of cold weather up there. One of the things that I talked about with one of the car dealers is they don't sell any electric vehicles because of the charging, and they find that it loses power real fast. What is the thought as far as how far, we have a couple in Littleton, but how far would we go north to those charging stations?
Well, again, if you, from my role as chair of Ways and Means, I'm thinking about rooms and meals tax, right? So where do we want to recover rooms and meals tax? Where we possibly stop people, you don't put a charging station, there's a possibility that people with electric vehicles aren't going to go there, which will remove that. And we know that the percentage of cars on the road that are EVs are going up. So if you don't even put them all the way up north and tip top of Colebrook, maybe you won't get any hunters up there. Maybe someone's not going to go up. We know pickup trucks is now becoming in electric, right? Tesla's product launch aside, even pickup trucks are becoming EVs as well. So,
Thank you.
Good things that we've been working on in the past and helps to leverage that funding. And I think there is a possibility to use ARPA funding actually embedded in the way that we're doing things. But wouldn't it be fair to say that, it's like we're likely to hear from DES that the maps that we're using to roll out the VW funds and the federal funds are substantially investing in the North Country?
thank you for the question. I'm going to say yes, but again, I want to remind you that we're investing on the charging station side, but not in the utility side, right? And so that was my big concern about this bill is that we're doing significant investment throughout the state, on the utility, on the business side of it, if you will, the charging station side. We've left the utilities hanging in the wind and making them do make-ready work that'll ultimately end up on the ratepayer, regardless of where the meter is.
Thanks. I'll ask some other folks.
Great.
Thank you.
Any other committee members? Thank you for your testimony. The chair will recognize Emily Kelly. Good afternoon.
Chair Ricciardi, Vice Chair Waters, and members of the Senate Transportation.
Can you please,
Sorry. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Kelly, and I'm the Public Policy Manager for the Eastern Region for Chargepoint. I'm here today to speak in support of Senate Bill 52. I emailed you all lengthier testimony yesterday, but just wanted to touch briefly on how this bill will improve the business case for investing in and deploying EV charging, particularly public fast charging. So a little background on Chargepoint. We're the nation's leading electric vehicle charging network. We have charging solutions for every charging need. Our fully integrated hardware and software products can charge EV drivers at home, at work, around town, and on long distance trips. Our primary business model is not to own and operate the chargers themselves, but to provide smart network charging solutions directly to businesses and organizations. We regularly sell our charging solutions to municipalities, retail stores, educational institutions, and fueling and convenience stores. Locally, ChargePoint is proud to partner with businesses in New Hampshire like Revision Energy to install our charging stations. So there are currently over 200,000 ports worldwide on the ChargePoint network, including 73 public ports in New Hampshire. So we're incredibly supportive of Senate Bill 52 and believe that it will help accelerate and assist in improving the business case of deploying public direct current fast charging. So as mentioned, the legislation will enable New Hampshire's utilities to make investments that will lower the customer's costs of installing EV charging infrastructure by supporting make-ready funding. And then additionally, this bill directs the utilities to design some sort of demand charge alternative rates. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important. But first off, make-ready infrastructure we think is crucial as it can represent 30 to 40% of the capital costs of an installation for the total expenditure for EV charging infrastructure deployment. So without a make-ready program, the burden of these fixed upfront potential or costs falls on local businesses, which would then have the potential impact of delaying or deferral of investments in charging. Specifically, again, Make Ready is the pre-wiring of the electrical infrastructure and includes such work as trenching, wiring, meters, conduit, transformers, and civil construction work. And honestly, without this work, a site cannot be made EV ready. So it's absolutely crucial. And then in terms of demand charges, so as you all know, probably most residential electric customers pay for the total amount of energy used each month in terms of kilowatt hours. In contrast, traditional commercial electric customers like big factories can have a much higher energy demand for prolonged periods of time. And they typically pay something called a demand charge based on the highest peak demand for power in any given month. So unfortunately, traditional electricity rates were never designed to reflect those unique characteristics of light, medium, and heavy duty EV charging, which in the case of public direct current fast charging, it can be characterized as having a low load factor with sporadic high energy uses. If two cars are plugged in at the same time, it can really drain a lot of energy. So not only do those who own and operate the charging stations, not only are they sometimes burdened with, the installation costs and the actual cost of the charger, but then they also sometimes have to face these high demand charges. So, which can account for 30 to 70% of electricity costs. So this bill also directs the utilities to come up with some sort of alternate solution, basically, to address those demand charges. I think it's also important to note that there currently is an estimated $3 billion in make-ready utility investment throughout the U.S. So from Massachusetts to North Carolina to Georgia to Oregon, many states in between, there has been huge amounts of investment in make-ready, and also many utilities in those states have addressed the demand charge issue. So this is something that's happening throughout the country. And we'd certainly like to see more of that happening in New Hampshire as well. So thanks again for the opportunity to provide testimony. I also emailed in, but if you have any questions, I'll take them now.
Any questions from the committee? Senator Waters?
Yeah, and thank you. And I, full disclosure, my car is currently plugged in across the street as a Chargepoint meter. Okay, so
That's great.
I'm sipping electricity as we speak. All right.
Yeah.
I had a couple of questions. First, do you think that this bill will help accelerate private investment by your companies and others in the New Hampshire space?
Absolutely. And like I said, our business model typically is not for ChargePoint to be the owner and operator. We will in some cases, but for the most part, we sell to third party, whoever wants to invest in charging. And I think these kinds of Investments by the utilities and demand charge reform will definitely help lower the cost, ideally, and then it will hopefully spur investment.
And if I may ask another,
Of course.
Madam Chair, thank you. So, on a demand charge issue, I guess I'm asking you to look in your crystal ball a little bit.
Okay.
Because we're in another committee wrestling with issues about distributed energy, and I'm very interested in vehicle to grid, and these new kind of technologies. And the
Yep.
question comes up about the metering and whether or not we can expect utilities to put the AMIs out. They're expensive. Or do you think that the company like Chargepoint or auto companies themselves might have the metering, real-time metering capacities in the vehicle, that could be used rather than having the commercial or other entity have to have the metering there to determine what sources are using what when?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a possibility. And I think as the auto industry evolves and there's, different kinds of EV models that are available on the market, which I think by the end of this year, there's supposed to be over 100, that will continue to evolve and you could see functions like that in the
Yeah, I
vehicle
think
as well.
Nissan's doing it now.
Oh, yeah,
But I
I'm
don't
sure.
know, I mean, it's just from your
Mhm.
company's perspective about
Yeah,
whether or not you think that the chargers you install might have a metering capacity that could be at that,
Yeah.
perform these functions.
Absolutely. No, I think that that's something that we'll definitely see in the future as the technology evolves. Things are still very much being created. So there's just, a lot of innovation, I think, still to come, and that could be something we see.
Thank you.
Great.
Any other
else?
members of the committee have any questions? Thank you for
Okay,
your
thank
testimony.
you.
The chair will recognize James Penfold. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is James Penfold. I'm the director of EV charging for Revision Energy. Revision Energy is New Hampshire's leading clean energy systems company. We are 20 years old, all employee-owned company, and with over 350 employees. We operate in 3 New England states with 2 branches in New Hampshire and have installed hundreds of EV charging projects. Currently, driving an EV into New Hampshire is like driving into a charger desert. While a few fast public chargers do currently exist, they are typically in high traffic and densely populated locations. It is rare to find fast chargers in rural, low traffic or seasonal areas, and this situation will remain so with the extremely high cost to install and operate chargers. While we can expect private investment in charging along the interstates from the Massachusetts border to Concord, we see very little appetite to invest north of Concord or in the southwest part of the state. So what makes the business case for EV charging in New Hampshire so poor, and how will this bill help? Firstly, there are the capital costs. A significant cost comes from installing the utility-owned infrastructure. This includes the new poles, wires, transformers, etc., to bring the power from the grid to a parking lot. And this can be over 30% of the total cost of the project. The customers must also pay for the installation of the infrastructure that is what we call behind the meter, or on the customer side. Finally, they must also pay for the most expensive equipment, the charging station. The total cost runs into hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, when we're talking about the cutting edge DC fast charging equipment that will be required to bring drivers into the state and get them back to their home. This bill would authorize the PUC to design utility programs that would make prudent investments in the infrastructure and not the customer's charging station. This is collectively referred to as make-ready. Secondly, there are the operational costs. Unlike residential electric bills, utilities assess their billing for peak power demand, or what are called demand charges. Demand charge rates were originally designed for steady power, such as in a factory, not EV chargers that have what we call spiky load profiles. Demand charges can be over 70% of a bill and can crush the business model. This is a significant deterrent to businesses, and we have even seen towns like Derry rip out their stations to avoid the high costs and unrecoverable demand charges. In conclusion, traditional electric rates are poorly suited to EV charging, and this bill will authorize the PUC to approve new rates for public EV charging stations that makes for a more sustainable economic business model. Most other PUCs and utilities in the Northeast have designed a variety of programs, and they have been successful in spurring private investment in charging stations in both urban and rural locations. All this is to say that without make-ready programs and an alternative rate design, private companies will likely choose to invest in other states that are more economically advantageous and supportive of EV sales. We support this bill, and as it lays the foundation for an effective and economically sustainable network of New Hampshire charging stations deployed through every corner of the state. Thank you. Happy to
Thank
take
you.
questions.
Any questions from the committee? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
The chair will call Nick Krakow.
Thank you very much. I'm Nick Krakow from the Conservation Law Foundation. I'm here to encourage you to support HB 52. And I want to talk mainly about the effects of HB 52. I think it's going to do three things for New Hampshire. The first is that it's going to help support the development of a robust EV charging network in New Hampshire. Second, it can eventually help to lead to lower electric rates for all consumers, even non-EV users. And third, it will really benefit New Hampshire's economy. As you've already heard, HB 52 will do two main things that will help reduce the barriers to EV charging investments. The first thing that we've already heard about is with the make-ready investments. It will allow the utilities to recover the cost of those, so the EV station operators are not solely responsible for those costs themselves, and those costs are a very high barrier to investments in EV charging. And second, it will direct the PUC to consider alternatives to demand charges. And as we've already heard, demand charges are a huge barrier to investments in EV charging, because when EV adoption rates are low, as they are currently, those demand charges can be a huge percentage of the monthly electric bill for station operators, even over 90% in some situations. So by reducing these two barriers to EV charging station investments, it will really facilitate the development of an EV charging station network in New Hampshire. Second, I just want to briefly talk about what I mentioned before, which is that EV charging stations and increased EV use can actually lower rates for all consumers. This is because when you have when you have more EV adoption and more EV use, that will increase the actual electricity being consumed, which will spread costs for electricity amongst more consumers, which can actually reduce rates for all electric consumers, not even just the EV adopters themselves. And then third, this will really benefit New Hampshire's economy, because as we've heard, a lot of tourists might be thinking about visiting New Hampshire, but if they drive EVs, they're going to skip over New Hampshire and go to Maine to go to the beaches there, or go to Vermont to go to the ski areas there, rather than choose New Hampshire. So by having a robust EV charging station network in New Hampshire, this will really encourage those tourists that drive EVs to visit the state rather than visiting other states. And I'd like to thank you for your time, and happy to answer any questions today that you have.
Any questions?
just
Senator
have a
Waters?
quick one. Could you just reiterate again, explain again how this is going to lower rates for all consumers? I've lost a couple words there. It'd be good to have that articulated.
Yeah, sure. So basically, as more people adopt EVs, it results in increased electric consumption, which in turn lowers electricity rates for all consumers by spreading the fixed costs over more kWh sales. So as you have more electricity being used, there's more, that's spread over all the customers more. And so there's reduced cost to all ratepayers.
If I may follow up, and fair enough to say, we heard the 2% to 7% in this country, other countries, and in Quebec, I think that's at 50% of new sales. But there is a kind of an end point, the auto companies, at which they're not going to be making very many conventionally fueled vehicles, and they'll be on the road for a long time. But this is a transition that is going to be accelerating, you would think, in terms of the adoption of EVs.
Correct, absolutely. So, I mean, we're at a very low EV adoption rate right now, but all the major car manufacturers, they're all investing in EVs, and they expect that EVs will be a large percentage of their fleets over the next decade and a half. So the manufacturers have clearly invested in EVs and expect that we're going to transition to an EV future, and we're starting to see that as more people adopt EVs. And one other thing I would like to mention is that I submitted written comments as well, and they go into a little bit more detail about how EV adoption can decrease rates for all users, and there's some sources there that you can look at as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much.
Senator Ward.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I
sorry.
have a question for you, sir.
Sorry about that.
It was very interesting to hear you say that with the increased use of electricity, the cost for everybody is going to go down, which usually happens in most places. The more you sell the price for each individual thing. Thinking in terms of increased use of EV, how about our electric supply? We are not really abundant right now. And as far as EVs, Switzerland has banned all sales of EVs because they use too much electricity. So how do you respond to that?
Well, one major way to do that is to adopt time of use rates. This bill doesn't really get into that, but the Public Utilities Commission has already adopted time of use rates for most EV usage in the state. And so basically what that does is it shifts demand and the charging of those EVs to times when there's less demand on the grid. So by using those kind of rates and shifting demand to the periods when there's less demand on the grid, you can avoid an increase in peak demand, peak load, which can obviate needs for new investments in the electric system. And so the PUC has already adopted that in several dockets here, and the PUC is already addressing that.
Okay, thank you for your answer, sir.
Sure.
Any other committee members? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
The chair will now recognize Sam Evans Brown.
Hi, folks. My name is Sam Evans Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Clean Energy New Hampshire. We are not typically, we're not often in front of the Transportation Committee, so just to familiarize you all with our organization, we represent New Hampshire individuals, municipalities, and businesses that have all signed up as part of our 501c3 nonprofit that all of which are interested in moving towards clean energy solutions and creating a policy framework for the state that encourages that move. We also convene the Drive Electric New Hampshire Coalition, which is really just sort of a monthly or quarterly meeting in which folks that are interested in electric vehicle policy and education come together to talk about programming and how to help the state move forward. It is out of those meetings that this bill emerged. And so I'd just like to assure you that there has been a lot of input and a lot of stakeholder feedback toward this approach. The utilities were part of our consultation in crafting this bill, as were the energy marketeers, which is the organization that represents the gas stations, as were the car dealerships, the NHADA was involved. Dan Bennett was in those meetings. So a lot of folks have given us the input that has led to the bill that's before you. of course, my written testimony has more detail if you're curious about why we think this is a really important bill. I do think the competitiveness of New Hampshire's tourism economy is the heart of why this is important to do now. The degree to which New Hampshire is falling behind our neighboring states is getting a bit alarming, and I think that the speed with which the manufacturers are transitioning towards electric vehicles really puts a pin in the urgency behind this bill. But to the question of the rate impacts to electric vehicle charging, I did a little math last night sitting on my couch. The average American drives about 34 miles a day, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation. For an electric vehicle, that's in the neighborhood of 8 kilowatt hours. I remember once visiting Hydro-Quebec years ago, and the spokesperson there said, it's about the same as an electric hot water heater. So a very manageable amount of load onto the system. But more than that, electric vehicles are very flexible load. You can plug them in whenever it's convenient, particularly with the batteries being much larger now. The average American drives 34 miles a day. EV batteries are now routinely have more than 200 miles of range, so you don't typically need the entire battery in a given day. And so you have a lot of flexibility as to when you might plug that in. And overwhelmingly, folks charge their cars at home overnight, which is a time of very low grid demand. A fun fact, the ISO New England average capacity factor, ISO New England is the regional grid operator. They're the nonprofit that makes sure that our lights turn on when we turn them on in this hearing room. The average capacity factor for a power plant in ISO New England is 53%, which is to say almost half the time the average power plant in the region is off. There's plenty of headroom on the system, especially when we're talking about flexible demand. So that's to say things that are not must run. So if you can plug your car in overnight when the stresses on the grid are very low, you increase your kilowatt hour sales. So those 8 kilowatt hours a day that I was tabulating on my spreadsheet at home last night translates to, over the lifetime of a car, a typical car lasts 14 years in the United States. There are some estimates that electric vehicles will last much longer because there are many fewer moving parts in them. There's much less maintenance required. Some estimates are that they'll be on the road for as much as 21 years. That translates to over $20,000 worth of electric sales over the lifetime of that vehicle. And so this speaks to Nick Krakoff's point earlier, which is to say, all of those sales, yes, there is an investment here by the utilities that is represented in the infrastructure needed to deliver that electricity. But that investment will be paid for by the sales of new electricity. The utility model is not like any other business model that you're familiar with. They're a regulated monopoly. And how our utility rates are set is there's what's called a revenue requirement, which is all of the money that the utility needs in order to deliver its service. And that revenue requirement, which could be, in the tens of millions of dollars, is divided by the kilowatt hour sales. So numerator and denominator. And with a higher denominator, the rate gets lower. And that's really why if this bill is implemented, I am quite confident that it will not result in increased distribution rates, particularly if the PUC does its work and evaluates these proposals in a rigorous way to ensure that there is not undue ratepayer impact.
Thank you for your testimony. On that last point too, a lot of this bill with potentially enhanced metering capacities means that vehicle to grid capacity for storage, so that in fact we might be building a storage system that can substantially reduce the peak load demand and the cost of electricity. Is that fair enough to say as this rolls out over time?
I am very bullish on vehicle to grid technologies, so I appreciate you teeing me up to wax philosophical on what is one of my favorite solutions going forward. The New Hampshire Electric Co-op currently has a pilot program that they're rolling out that will enable consumers to monetize their electric vehicles for exactly this purpose. What it is it's a real-time price that's sent out over the internet the night before at 4 p.m. each day. You get a different price for every hour of the day, and you have the devices in your home can be set up to receive that price and respond automatically to it. Specifically, they're targeting backup batteries installed in people's homes and electric vehicles. And Plymouth State University was the first, out of the trenches over the wire to experiment with this new program. And the co-op, and I'm going to forget the exact number, but I can see the slide in my head, estimates that per vehicle, the payments per vehicle that that Plymouth State is going to be able to attain from letting their battery be dispatched as a grid resource will more than pay for the lease on the car. So I see it as a huge solution, and the fact that these batteries are getting bigger, and again, you don't need the entire battery in a day, means that we can use them as grid resources that will actually pay customers back for deploying them, and which should help buy down the still slightly higher upfront cost of buying an electric vehicle.
Madam Chair, do we have somebody speaking for the New Hampshire auto dealers?
No.
Then I'll ask you this question, and we have an auto dealer right here. He's not testifying. Anyhow, since you have talked to the auto dealers on this, would it be fair to say, that the issues that we're having in the state for auto dealers are less related to weather, because Quebec's a lot colder and half the vehicles up there are electric. But the difficulties they're facing in getting the cars over the curb, if they've got them, is the anxieties about charging. Would that be fair to say? The charging infrastructure.
So there's two sides to that question. One is the consumer demand, and then the actual supply from the manufacturers. On the consumer demand side, I believe that charging infrastructure is a huge reason why consumers are still anxious here in New Hampshire. There was a study that I'd be happy to forward to the committee that looked at cost effectiveness in terms of approaches to encourage folks to invest in an electric vehicle, and it found that deploying charging is a very cost-effective solution, because then folks see it, they get comfortable with the idea, and they're willing to invest. And so I think that if there is less demand in New Hampshire than in our surrounding states, the lack of infrastructure is a key reason why. When it comes to the supply from the manufacturers, obviously there are pinch points here. There's been huge announcements of investments in manufacturing capacity, particularly for batteries, that will be coming online in the coming years. And so there will be more EVs on the lots in the years to come as those investments are made. But also that the fact that there's a limited amount of cars that are available to the nation means that manufacturers ship them preferentially to the states where demand is highest, which is to say they go where they can sell them, which tends to be states that are investing in programs to encourage electric vehicle adoption to begin with.
And just on that last point, one of the problems New Hampshire auto dealers are having is that some manufacturers won't send the packages here because we're not on the CalEV standards, or they don't see sufficient support in the state for EV deployment. Now, fair or not, whether you like the manufacturers doing what they're doing or not, that is becoming kind of a reality for New Hampshire auto dealers. And so wouldn't this bill at least demonstrate some commitment by the state to helping out the auto dealers and get some charging going?
I think that's correct. I think it also depends a great deal on the types of make-ready programs that the utilities propose. This bill really is a framework. It is not prescriptive. It does not say do X, Y, Z. It says here's how the Public Utilities Commission will consider proposals of make-ready investments. So it depends what the utilities put on the table. That said, I think if Dan Bennett were here, he would what he has told me and what he would repeat is that the manufacturers don't make their decisions based on CalEV. They make their decisions based on sales, and the sales tend to flow particularly from rebates. So rebates, as cash on the hood of the car, rebates tends to be what gooses sales of electric vehicles. And so the states that have rebates at point of sale tend to be the ones that get preferentially shipped vehicles.
Any other comments from members of the committee? Okay, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
The chair will recognize Jessica Keeler. Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Chairman Ricciardi and members of the committee. Thank you for having me today. My name is Jessica Keeler. I'm the president of Ski New Hampshire. We represent 32 ski areas across the state, and I'm also here representing about a dozen other organizations today from the travel and tourism community, including White Mountain Attractions, Lakes Region Tourism Association, Lakes Region Chamber of Commerce, Hampton Chamber, and several others. I do have a letter here that has been signed by all of them that I will pass around for you to review, and that shares some of the information that I'm just going to talk generally about today. I won't bore you with reading it right now. Thanks. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about some of the comments that Senator Lang made in his introduction. He was giving the scenario of being a skier and driving up to Loon, and how people would want to be able to plug in while they're skiing, and then know that they can make it back home wherever home is for them. Loon has 3 chargers, 2 Tesla and 1 Universal, not enough to service the number of EV drivers that are coming there. The only other ski area that has chargers right now is Cranmore, and they have 2 Tesla chargers. Now, a lot of our skiers are looking into this, but they're often discouraged by the costs of putting in those chargers, the make ready side of things, and all the costs associated with that. Whereas just thinking about Killington in Vermont, for example, they currently have 30 Tesla chargers and 15 Universal. So the argument that we're competing against other states around us when we're talking about travel and tourism is real. We know that Vermont is doing a lot more to invest in EV charging infrastructure. Maine is as well, and New Hampshire is just sort of creeping along. I'm glad we're having this conversation today because I think this bill is really important to move us forward. In conversation with my colleague Michelle Cruz at the Mount Washington Valley Chamber of Commerce, she says that they're starting to get increasing numbers of people calling to find out, do you have chargers in the area? And I can tell you, as a EV owner myself, I just bought one in July from Maine because they had them, that we have maybe 4 chargers that are easily accessible by the public there that are non-Tesla. Tesla has put a bank of them at a local grocery store, but not everyone's driving Teslas. And especially, I think, as we're seeing more and more of the manufacturers who are planning to only manufacture EVs, some of them, like by 2035, for example, we're just going to see a lot more of those EVs coming, and we need to be prepared to service them. Otherwise, as others have mentioned here today, they are going to choose to go to Vermont, they are going to choose to go to Maine, or they're just going to choose to go somewhere else entirely. One of the things that my letter here mentions is that the ISO, about a year ago in February, they had reported that they expected there to be about 1.5 million EVs on the road in New England. And I think about half a million of those would be coming from Massachusetts, which is a key market area for us. That report doesn't even mention states like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, other places where we do get a lot of drive traffic. And it also doesn't mention the number of cars coming from Canada, Quebec specifically. We get a ton of traffic from Canada. Not so much, they don't come down to ski so much because they have some nice ski areas up there, I'm told. But we get a lot of those visitors in the summer months. And again, if they're not seeing an infrastructure where they can charge, they're going to choose to take different routes. And that's going to cost our communities that rely very heavily on tourism. I know Senator Gendro, being from the North Country, you understand that. Me living in Conway, I'm from Conway. I don't really have anywhere that I can charge. So we take short trips, or we spend a lot of time trying to figure out where we're going to go to make sure that we know that we can get back. And honestly, it's easier for me to go to Portland and get back than it is for me to go somewhere in the North Country and know that I can charge somewhere. Let's see. Just to go back real quick to the mention of the costs associated with installing chargers. Our skiers are very interested in doing this. They see it as a service for people who are coming to ski, but there's only so much they can do. There are likely to be more people driving those electric vehicles who want to charge all day, and they can't. Like, I've already been told by Loon that people show up first thing in the morning to get those 3 charging stations that they have. Everyone else loses, and there's nowhere else for them to go in Lincoln to go charge up necessarily. So this is something that, yes, businesses need to adopt, but I think it's something that, communities are interested in as well, because we want to be able to service them. It's an economic impact proposition for a lot of those places too. If you think about citing some of these charging stations in towns like Lincoln or North Conway or wherever, people park, they charge for a few hours, they walk around, they spend money, that results in tax revenue for the state. I guess that's all. Again, I don't want to belabor what's already in my comments, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from the committee? Yes.
You had mentioned, Jessica, about some people calling like chambers of commerce. Is there currently a place where, let's say I have an electric vehicle and I want to go to Maine, a universal spot, maybe a website that I could go to, so along the way I could see? Or is it just individual chambers, towns that publish it?
Yeah, no, there are several apps actually that you can get on
Okay.
your phone. So that's definitely something you do when you have an EV. You download probably more than one app, Chargepoint. I have a few others as well, and you can look and see where those chargers are. There is also a website too, which I referenced. There are some sources here that you might find interesting for reading, and I'm happy to send this as a electronic document too, so that you can actually click on these links rather than trying to type that in. But you can see in advance. My guess is that some of those people are just calling because they're like, oh, well, maybe it's just not on the map yet. They're maybe a little concerned and want to just double check to make sure that there is nothing there, and maybe they're reconsidering their plans.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I'll show you my app after the hearing.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Even that, you can see 'em, every one of them.
Any other comments from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
The chair will recognize Joshua Elliott.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Josh Elliott. I'm the Director of the Division of Policy and Programs with the New Hampshire Department of Energy. The department is neutral on this bill. However, we did want to highlight some concerns that we have. And this is really just to point out sort of the impact here. If you look at the text of the bill, really it's page 3, lines 10 through 12 that is really the crux of it. The balance of the bill, I think, is prior to this. The department has no objections to. But essentially, what this language does is it makes it more likely that EV charging, this make-ready infrastructure, will be approved by the Public Utilities Commission. So I say that because that will have a direct impact on rates. If you make it more likely for something to happen, it's going to happen more, and there's going to be a cost to it. Of course, all of these investments have a cost to it. In the case of the way that the bill is structured, it would be the electric ratepayers who are paying for it. So that's everybody in the state seeing increased electric bills in order to pay for these sorts of infrastructure upgrades. So there's a current process now that utilities will have to go through in order to do this infrastructure upgrades. So it's not impossible. There are certain tests that have to be met, and there has to be a good business case for the utilities to make these investments. They also get, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, they get a rate of return on this investment as well, because it's physical infrastructure. So there is nothing that's inherently stopping any utility from currently doing this infrastructure themselves, or from a private business if they want to fund the upgrades themselves. That being said, I just wanted to make that abundantly clear to the committee that there will be an impact on electric rates because of this change. So it takes sort of one of the steps of the decisions out of the Public Utilities Commission's hands and says, yes, you're going to do this, okay, as long as it meets these things, rather than should you do this or not. But the answer is automatically by this legislation going to be yes, provided that you meet all these other circumstances. Regardless of however you feel about that, and that's certainly a policy decision to be made by the committee, I would draw your attention to lines 17 through 27 on page 3 of the bill, with the requirement to open another for the Public Utilities Commission to open another docket to address a couple of these issues, including demand charge alternative rate, demand charge holiday, etc. In talking to my colleagues on the regulatory side of the department, these issues are already being addressed in existing dockets. Those are 20-170 and 21-078. In the concern with 20-170, they have been set up for several of the utilities. Eversource was not a party to the settlement, so there's going to be hearing on, January 31st of this year to discuss that. And there were several parties who did not decide to join the settlement, as a matter of public record, we're here to testify today on this. So I would suggest that these sections of the bill, regardless of however you feel about the infrastructure piece of it, be struck out because there's an existing process that has already been done. It's already gone through at the Public Utilities Commission. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions the committee has.
Senator Waters.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the last point, Josh, having been an expert on this, but having paid pretty close attention to what the PUC has been doing about some of the dockets that were open from Eversource and Unitil and Liberty on this side of thing, and having authored the original language in the bill that opened that first docket, at the top of page 3, wouldn't it be fair to say, though, that there are some specifics here that are a little bit different from what the PUC has been using as its criteria in those other dockets?
In terms of, I'm sorry, in terms of the top of the bill,
line
or
17 to 27, I mean, aren't there some differences here in terms of what is being looked at potentially than are under the existing dockets?
Yeah, so I will confess I am not an expert on the specific dockets or in the regulatory matters. Having consulted with our regulatory team, I can read the email 20-170 where commercial EV time of use rates with a demand charge alternative were recently approved for Unitil and Liberty. A residential time of use rate was also approved for Unitil. Liberty had already had a residential rate approved during its case 19-064, et cetera. It goes on. Various demand charge alternatives were considered as part of this docket process, but ultimately, through settlement, the settling parties being Liberty, Unitil, Department of Energy, Department of Environmental Services, and the Office of Consumer Advocate, a half a demand charge was proposed and submitted and approved for commercial. Eversource did not join the settlement, was required to submit a rate design. The hearing on Eversource's proposed rates are on January 31st. Conservation Law Foundation, Clean Energy New Hampshire, and Chargepoint did not join the settlement. The reason for the half demand charge from the settlement, quote, this is quoting from the order, maintaining 50% demand charge is intended to alleviate distribution revenue shortfall created by low utilization stations.
Yes, and thank you. And I think maybe we could ask Sam Brown, Madam Chair, if that's appropriate, because he was seeing it a little bit more the way I was. And I think particularly on line 26, 27 is different. And also, I think that, we have some history of the PUC making some statements around EV charging, which were just erroneous. And so the necessity of having some clarification here. So I guess what I'm saying is I think they are apples and oranges, but maybe we'll hear some more about that. And back to your first point about potential, all recoverable costs are recoverable because they potentially meet a social or economic good. Isn't that the case?
That is correct, and this would shift the standard that currently is in place for EV charging.
Yeah, and given what we've heard from the tourism industry, and let's not even get into the whole notion about what we're trying to do for air quality and climate and all that stuff. But
Let's stick to the topic.
wouldn't
Okay,
it
Senator
be
Waters.
fair to say, though, that the concept here of what is the public good on EV infrastructure is a case that is very active?
I would say yes. In terms of trying to find revenue to find this, we do have a meals and rooms tax. You could potentially carve out some of M&R in order to fund for these upgrades rather than asking all the ratepayers to do it.
So you want to ask the people who are buying a meal instead of the ratepayers? Okay, good.
If they're coming here for
Text the other guy.
if there's a tourism argument,
I want to drive my EV, plug in at the restaurant, eat a meal, and I'll pay both times, okay? Thank you.
Does any other member of the committee have any comments? Thank you so much for your testimony.
thank you very much.
Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak?
Madam,
Yes.
Can we ask Becky Oler to come up?
Okay, he raised his hand.
Oh, I'm
so
sorry, I didn't
could
see it. But, yeah,
I would like,
Excuse me, I didn't see it.
would you like to come forward, please?
My apologies.
For the record, my name is Jackson Boulay. I work at Denny and Boulay, and we also represent the New Hampshire Auto Dealers Association. And just very quickly, we are in support of the bill. And as Mr. Evans Brown said earlier, it really is the sales from the manufacturers, not necessarily the legislation. So that's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like to come forward? Thank you.
I'm sorry.
If I may, Madam Chair, and thank you for having her up. So I have two questions. One is that could you provide a little detail on, the kind of where charging stations are going out under the RFP for the Volkswagen and the NEVI planning related to the North Country? The Senator General was curious about that.
Yeah, certainly. So we have about $4.6 million from the Volkswagen settlement, the whole Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal of several years ago. And we have put out a request for proposals and got in a number of proposals. I think it was something like 48 proposals at 35 different sites, and it touched every corner of New Hampshire. With our $4.6 million, we are going to be able to fund 12 to 14 of those. I believe right now we have 14, so it might be 14 to 16, depending on where the costs come in. Absent that sort of funding available to these applicants, because there's not a lot of electric vehicles sort of in the early stages right now, there is no business case for them to go in and make these investments themselves. And some of these locations, some don't require much in the way of utility upgrades to be able to put the chargers in, maybe $5,000 to $10,000 worth of work. But in some areas where we really need charging to just even get a skeleton around the state, we're looking at $100,000 worth of investments just to be able to put a charger in some of these locations. And again, we strategically selected the sites that we are going to fund to make sure that we are getting them. The very first one that's made it through the Governor and Executive Council is in Errol, at the Errol General Store. And we need one up there. We need it was brought up, Canadian visitors. I mean, the rate of EV adoption in Quebec is huge because the residents get subsidies to buy electric vehicles, and there's a lot of charging there. And when I was talking with the owner of the Errol General Store, he said at least half of his customers are from Canada during the tourist season. So,
If I may ask one more question. The Senator Lang was talking a bit about whether or not any of the federal funding or the VW funding can be used for Make Ready, and could you clarify that?
I don't know on the federal funding. We're working with DOT on the NEVI funding, but they're the ones running that program, and so I don't have the details of that in my head. But I can certainly find out. With the Volkswagen funding, we made the decision not to use any of the funding for the Make Ready side of this because, number one, we have a very limited amount of money, and we were more interested in getting the chargers in. But also, once that infrastructure goes in, it's there and usable for a lot of things other than EV charging. And so that really is an investment in the distribution system. And we didn't feel it was appropriate to use our limited dollars to sort of be paying for infrastructure that yes, might support that EV charging station, but could also support the new business that's going to go up next door because they've upgraded the system.
You're welcome. Any other comments? Thank you very much for your coming up here and your
Thank you.
testimony. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak to Senate Bill 52 FN? Seeing none, I'm going to close the hearing on SB 52 FN. Thank you. We are not going to be execing this today. There are some unanswered questions and there needs to be some due diligence. So thank you for coming. Could I have a motion to adjourn?
Make that motion.
Thank you.